Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our last food for thought for the year 2024. We are going to talk about artificial intelligence today, and we've pulled in an expert from UW Green Bay, Paul Belanger. And there's a lot of slides and I know we're going to have a lot of questions, so we're really eager to hear and talk all about AI. So let's get started, Paul.
All right. Well, thanks a lot for having me, Elizabeth and Andrea, and everybody that is part of the league. Really excited to be with you today to talk about AI and to think about, just sort of how we're incorporating it in a meaningful and ethical way. I was really pleased to take a look through the small magazine or newsletter that comes out on a regular basis. It looks as if, as a group, you're doing a really good job of thinking about these things already. So hopefully I can contribute to the discussion, maybe present some new sort of ideas and things to think about as we're going through. Just a little bit about me. I'm a professor over at UWGB. My sort of work with artificial intelligence goes back about 10 years now when I was looking at artificial neural networks in the pursuit of a model of creativity in particular. So when OpenAI came out in 22 and said, "Hey, look at this cool thing we have, ChatGPT," and the whole world went a little bit nuts. It was kind of a reaffirming moment for me that some of that research was indeed pointed in the right direction, but it was also a careful what you wish for moment. Sometimes we have these big dreams, and then as they're being realized, we realize that maybe we haven't fully thought through all of the consequences, the uses, etc. So I want to talk to you today a little bit about the idea of artificially enhanced intelligence as opposed to the sort of what I think is a misnomer of AI itself, right? That the machine itself is actually intelligent. And I think if we can kind of readjust the way we think about this technology or this raft of technologies, we'll actually find ourselves better able to employ it in our personal lives, in our business lives, etc. So we'll go ahead and we're just going to start with a little bit of a definition of AI. And so we're going to go back to 1968, actually even earlier, 1956 at a summer institute is when this term artificial intelligence was first coined. 1968, Minsky came out, had one of sort of the most popular definitions. And really, it's the science of making machines do things that would require intelligence if done by humans. A couple other quotes on there that you can take a look at, showing that essentially we've kept to this premise throughout the sort of evolution of the technologies. So AI is a really diverse raft of technologies that are just geared towards helping us perform jobs that we would otherwise have to use our own intelligence, time, resources to handle. And this means that there are actually several types of AI, and they've been around since the 1950s. Alan Turing had asked, can machine thinks way back in 1950. From there, we took off. We had Ada Lovelace shortly after him talking about artificial intelligence and the idea that we really need to see creativity, not just outputs that resemble human sort of production there. And as we moved, it was a slow burn, a lot of peaks and troughs along the way. But that started with this sort of idea of traditional AI, things that we've actually probably have been familiar with for quite a long time. So when we're talking about traditional AI, we're talking about really those rules-based, pre-programmed, it's totally predictable what the output will be, right? And so this can be used to complete basic tasks like providing rules for your emails. I don't know if we all do that. I know inbox zero was a big thing a while ago. I prefer to run an inbox infinity because I just have so many emails come through. To set up rules for all of them would be baffling. If you play video games, you have those NPCs, those non-player characters that you give them a line of text and they have some set lines that they'll spit back at you. But even our library catalog systems are based on AI. You know exactly what you're going to get out depending on what you put into it. Sometime in the sort of early 2000s, we really saw discriminative AI start to come into its own. And this is where we had where the AI itself is not necessarily rules based. Instead, we start to use some machine learning. We use some training on it in order to help the machine establish what we call decision boundaries. So essentially, the ability to make classifications and predictions based on those classifications, uh, based on the sort of feed materials that we feed into it. This gets us more to what we tend to think of as, I think, human intelligence, where it's not just rules based, it's not pre programmed, but it's a little bit more flexible than that. And these could be seen in things like our spam detection, autocomplete. If you jumped onto, your Outlook account or started typing a text right now, you would have these sort of suggestions that, well, it's probably going to be one of these three words, right? So very simple sorts of AI, and what most of us, I don't think, would think of as intelligence. And then, of course, when we had like Snapchat come in and people were able to put filters on their images, their faces, their video, etc., this was discriminative AI, essentially a computer program that was able to discern where the face or the body stops and where the rest of the world begins. In fact, you can see my hand getting a little bit blurry in the corner of the screen there. That's that discriminative AI. The boundaries are getting a little bit blurry, and so that the images that you're seeing likewise begin to get blurry. We're losing that tracking. And this is, really fantastic. It can do some great things. But it was in 2022, OpenAI came out and said, we have figured out a way to make generative AI work and to make it available for the broader population. And this is what all of the buzz has really been about. So generative AI, you'll see me just use GAI as we're going through the slides here to talk about this. But when we're looking at generative AI, we're looking at not just establishing those decision boundaries, but ways that we can remix the sort of relationships between those different classifications so that we can come up with what appears to be novel outputs. We can give it a command, write me a poem in the style of Dr. Seuss, welcoming a new employee to the office, whatever it might be, and it will be able to remix what it knows or thinks it knows about Dr. Seuss's type of poetry, word choice, etc., in order to do just that. So large language models are this is sort of the prime example. And probably the first sort of experience you're going to have with generative AI if you haven't already done so. So this is, things like Anthropic's Claude, OpenAI's ChatGPT, Google's Gemini, so on and so forth. Then there are also art generators. Our Snapchat filters have gotten smarter as they've started to integrate generative AI into it so that we have not just better sort of tracking of those decision boundaries, but the overlays themselves are better able to sort of conform to the thing that they're tracking, our faces, what have you. So we're going to speak largely about generative AI. And I think it's important to have just some of exactly what's going on in the background. Generally using artificial neural networks at the moment. And the way that these are, let me go ahead and reshare my screen. I'm not sure what happened there.
Yeah, we were
Did it
having
drop
some
out on your end
audio.
too, Elizabeth?
Yeah, we were having some audio issues,
Oh,
and I was starting to wonder if it was just me.
okay.
Um,
Are we good to go?
yeah, go
Or do you
ahead
need a
and
second?
reshare your screen. No, go ahead. Um,
And it should be sharing now.
yes, it's sharing now. If it continues, I'm going to suggest that you would just cut your video. That will
Okay.
save some bandwidth.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a little choppy.
Yes, the sound
All
was
right.
choppy. Yeah.
My daughter's home sick today, so who knows? She might be on TikTok or Instagram using some of these generative AI filters right now. But certainly I'll turn that off. You don't need to look at my mug in order to take something away today. So the way that these are trained is that we feed all of this data that we have sort of scraped from our human experience and production into an artificial neural network, which is really just like a decision type matrix. We feed this in and we run it through these hidden layers. And these are the layers that are right in the middle. If you look at, I don't know if you can see my mouse here, but that second step in the feed forward network, we move them into there and we put them through often several of these layers until something is spit out the other end. And what it's doing is it's establishing probabilities that the different elements of in this case, the image could be a word, right? What we sometimes call tokens. What is the probability that it is the token we're trying to identify or what the next token after it would be? So you can see when we feed forward and we get to that column where it's actual values, in that first line, we're looking for the answers airplane, automobile, and bird. But on the back side, the actual values that the machine spits out are truck, deer, and bird. So we only had one of the three being correct. What we can do then is we can have the human step in and we can indicate which ones were right, which ones were wrong. Those that were wrong, we accord a loss function to them and we go back and essentially we start tweaking the values, the weights and biases of each of those decision points within that artificial neural network. And we can do that 100, 1,000, a million times until the output starts to align with what we would say is the correct answer or seems to be a human generated answer if we were generating, say, text out of here. That process is called backpropagation, where we're feeding it back into it, the incorrect answers back into it to change those weights. But eventually we do get at something that starts to produce what seems to be human level productions or outputs. But really, all we're looking at here is a probability-based remix machine. It's like a glorified autocomplete, right? In fact, as we saw when we were breaking down from that traditional to the generative, that's really what we've done. We've complicated some of these earlier models, but ultimately it's only as smart as the data that it's trained on. And believe it or not, as all the data that we create on a regular basis that's been created over over human history, we're actually starting to run out of it. And so the quality of the data that we have available to feed into a lot of these models isn't as good as it once was. And so we have to watch out for sort of model degradation or collapse as we are seeking to expand models using this current architecture. But anybody that's played with it will note that the architecture really does its job. It starts to sound human. It starts to sound intelligent. But in this probability-based remix, we're really just looking at a mimicry, a facsimile of language and of image, sound, video, right, etc. All of these things, all of these different mediums are being rolled out and at increasing speeds. The mimicry has gotten so good that it was back in 22 when OpenAI first rolled it out that the Turing test, which is a famous sort of test that is purported to gauge in artificial intelligence, was declared passed with flying colors. And I think about once every month or two, there's another article that comes out and says, hey, the Turing test was passed. Well, Alan Turing, one of the early sort of thinkers about artificial intelligence, who first asked, can machines think, had set this up as a sort of game, an imitation game is what he called it. And it wasn't that the machine was actually going to be intelligent, but it would fool us into thinking it is. And the way that this test works is that we have the human evaluator. So in this case, let's call it the user. That human evaluator or user will have a conversation with a machine and then another conversation with a human. If that evaluator, that user can't tell the difference between the two, the idea is that the test has been passed and we have reached artificial intelligence. Now, this is a metric that's been used for a long time. There was an annual competition to see which sort of programs could come closest to passing the Turing test. Indeed, it's been passed with flying colors now, but to claim that that is intelligence is still deeply problematic. Because what we're really looking at here is a counterfactual argument. The counterfactual argument revolves around us imagining or projecting the thought that the thing is intelligent rather than it being intelligent. Because it sounds human, we make this sort of leap or this assumption that it's human. We start to anthropomorphize it. But just because it can spit out language that sounds as if a human created it doesn't mean there's intelligence behind it. It would be like me saying, well, the dishwasher, it does dishes as well, frankly, probably better than I do. It doesn't do them the same way. It doesn't require the same skill set. So that this imitation that we have, as uncanny as it is, as great as it is not intelligence. It's not the same as being intelligent. Rather, I want us to start with this understanding that AI, at the end of the day, is not intelligent. It is, frankly, it's dumb. And that it's we who put the I in AI. So, and that I stands not just for intelligence, it also stands for intention. We have to give it the sort of direction that we want it to pursue. It stands for insight. We bring our human creativity to it. That is something that it doesn't do well. Even the mimicry of it, as we will see, starts to become homogenous and starts to repeat itself. And we put the integrity into it as well, because the machine, at the end of the day, cannot be responsible for its outputs or what we do with it. So it's important that we remain at the forefront of our use of artificial intelligence, keep our proverbial hand on the wheel. Now, what we might have here, though, is the ability to enhance our intelligence. So we can go back and we can look at this idea of there being two types or two systems of thought that humans use. The first is system one. In system one thought, this is that fast, intuitive, automatic thinking that we engage in, right? It's our sort of knee-jerk reactions to a stimuli. These are often helpful for surviving or moving quickly about our day, but they also come with a lot of errors. To offset those errors, we have a system two thinking. And this is slower, right? This is that deliberate thought where we're able to step back and reflect on the sort of contents of the system one. We're able to engage in sort of logical deduction, thinking, problem solving, etc. Now, I would suggest, and other thinkers have, is that system one is more along the lines of what we have with general artificial intelligence. System two, it doesn't do very well, though newer models have tried to incorporate some sort of system two into it. So modern thinkers have suggested, well, perhaps what we have now is a system zero. And this is our external sort of adjuncts to thought. These are those cybernetic enhancements that we have when we use AI to help with our decision making, not to replace us, not to make the decisions for us, but to help us think through them a little bit more clearly, to perhaps go out and explore other opportunities or ideas that might emerge that we wouldn't have been able to come up with on our own. So rather than thinking of these AI systems as being intelligent as on their own, I want us to think of them as ways to enhance our own intelligence, to become that adjunct to thought. Now, of course, with this sort of incredible mimicry we have experienced a whole lot of hype and hope and hyperbole surrounding these technologies. That AI is going to come in and it's going to demolish the 5-day work week, and suddenly we're all going to have all sorts of free time, that we are going to be 100% more productive than we ever were before. In fact, I was at a conference recently and they were throwing around 4 times as productive. I would suggest anybody that has used AI, at least to date, will suggest that 4 times our productivity is being a bit silly. In fact, if anything, often, at least early on, the use of AI might actually slow us down. It might slow us down, but we might get better results at the end of it. So we have those who are really hyping this up and saying, that AI is going to revolutionize everything it touches. Now, I would suggest that this is largely going to be the case. It will. Now, for better or worse, I think that'll be a mixed bag, because on the other end of that spectrum, we have those people who are almost dystopian in their viewpoints on AI. And they're thinking that, they're thinking of Skynet from Terminator, and it's going to come in, it's going to steal your job, it's going to take over the world, it is going to destroy, human civilization as we know it. More recently, we have those who have looked at the failures of our current instances of AI and said, oh, it must just be a passing fad. Oh, wrong slide here. That is the internet. If you remember way back when in 2000, when people were saying the internet isn't going to have that big of an impact on us. Well, look at us now, right? And so we have some who are suggesting that AI is losing its hype in the same way, that people are becoming disillusioned with it. And if you look at the sort of subtitle there, that for some, this loss of hype is actually proof that the tech will succeed, is rooted in the history of technological advancements, including the internet itself. And this is based on the Gartner hype cycle, where we have a technology trigger and it happens, sort of in these labs that are far off from our everyday lives. The average person won't have any idea of what's going on. So if we talked about machine learning 10 years ago, right, 99% of the population would look at you with a blank face. You mention machine learning now, and most people have at least heard of it. So as that technology grows and that visibility grows, we tend to get this sort of inflated expectation. I would suggest that we are at or moving past that set of inflated expectations now, that all of those sort of utopian and dystopian visions are starting to give way. They're starting to break. Businesses are realizing that AI is not a panacea for all of their problems. It is not going to quadruple their efficiency. And so that we're moving into what the Gartner group calls that trough of disillusionment, where there's this pushback against the technology. And I think that we see that in AI in a way that we haven't seen in other technologies, because it's not just that there are faults in the technologies, but there's also a almost sort of human and what I call the anthropic bias, right? We push back against AI productions because it has that sense that it's not actually human. For all intents and purposes, on the surface, you think, yeah, sure, this sounds great, but something's off. The images aren't quite right. The text doesn't sound, exactly as we would expect a human to write. But if we are in that trough of disillusionment, like that last headline, I think it's a good space to be in, because now we can engage in conferences and workshops and seminars like today's to move beyond that trough and actually figure out, where does AI fit into our workflow? How can we best use it? And enter that slope of enlightenment, and ultimately, when it becomes just part of our everyday life, that plateau of productivity. Now, it's no surprise that we would be at this sort of trough, that there's some ill will emerging even amongst the CEOs and CIOs of these big corporations and even smaller businesses. Because 60 to 80% of the AI projects that are being rolled out fail. Sometimes because of a misunderstanding of the problem, often because they don't have the data, right? We talked about the importance of quality data early on. This is vital when we're trying to train our own AI to do, profession-specific jobs. Could be a lack of infrastructure. Sometimes we just get caught up in the hype and we try to solve everything with AI. And often the models aren't ready for it, and they might never be ready for it. Now, that said, while we have 60 to 80% failure rate of these big enterprise type of projects, we do see that individuals that are using it in their own way tend to show improvements, and quite pronounced improvements at that. So that a recent study by Ethan Mollick, who is sort of on the cutting edge of this, has noted that 40%, that AI users, the product tends to be of 40% higher quality, and they tend to move about 25% more quickly through their tasks. And this was for a study of business consultants. I would suggest that these numbers would differ depending on the field that they're being drawn from. But as a general rule, we do see that individuals using AI show improvement, and that those who have had some form of training tend to show even stronger improvements in quality. So again, being here today, reading that current magazine that has come out, employing those sort of techniques is going to be vital for getting the most out of the technology. And yet, there's always caveats here. It is terribly promising. Yes, maybe. But what we tend to see is that improvement, that sort of 40% in terms of quality, that 25% in speed, tends to be found amongst the lowest performing employees. So that's great. We're bringing our average up in terms of the overall quality, in terms of how long it's going to take, say, new hires, perhaps to perform a task. But those who are already strong performers, we actually can see often a reduction in productivity, at least early on. And that's largely a matter of having to go slower in order to go faster, to figure out what works for that individual in that context. I think another major sort of reality check that we have to have, and that businesses and governments have been having, is that AI is not reliable because it's not replicable and because we can't explain what happens. Those artificial neural networks, everything that happens between the input and the output, we don't see, we can't explain. And so when we start getting different answers from the same prompt in the same system, well, we have a problem. And if we can't trust the system to produce accurate responses and other outputs, then we have a very hard time rolling it out through our institutions, whether those are public or private. And of course, beyond just this reliability and this replicability, there are some really severe limitations. Now, Ethan Malik, in thinking about those limitations, coined the term the jagged frontier. And I think that as we are trying to move up that slope of enlightenment, that's really what we're doing, is we're trying to map out the jagged frontier. And all Malik means by this is that AI is really good at some tasks. A simple email, sorry, I can't make it into work today because I'm ill, it could smash 100%. It could do that without really any issues at all. But other tasks, and even those of seemingly equal difficulty, it will find to be hard. And it's not always as you would expect. So even for me, it blows my mind that I can have a AI model that can write me a sonnet in 3 seconds, but it can't calculate 11 plus 1, right? It struggles with things like basic math and logic. To complicate matters, not only is it difficult to tell in advance which tasks it will be good at or bad at, that frontier, that sort of boundary line is constantly shifting, and it's different for every model. So we really have to be kind of on our toes every time that we are using AI to complete a task. And we do have to slow down in order to go faster. So if we were thinking about, well, how do we map this jagged frontier then? It's about figuring out, well, which tasks does it make sense to use this for? Which tasks, might not make sense, and which are going to need human oversight? So for instance, for me as a instructor, AI is really good at building things like rubrics. It's really good at maybe making up just some basic visuals for a slide deck, sort of like the one that you see here off to the right. But it's not good at other things. It's not terribly good at evaluating the quality of a student's essay, nor would I ever feel that it's ethically okay to feed somebody else's intellectual property into one of these models where it might be scooped up and used to retrain them. So essentially, I'm then giving away that other person's intellectual property. So if we can move slowly and start figuring out which tasks make sense for which models, then we can start to think about, well, how are we going to integrate it? Are we going to become what Malik calls a centaur or a cyborg? And the centaur, if you remember your myth, half human, half horse, right? This is where we really identify it's good for this set of tasks, but it's not good for that. And so we maintain the fully human where it makes sense. So might be communicating with your customers or your end users. You need to maintain that human touch. So that might be something where when you're sending that email out, you really stop and you think to yourself, hey, I need to be in full charge of this. Even if you say use AI on the back end to help you clean up your language a little bit, you're still engaging mostly as human, augmenting it with that sort of AI. Others might aim to become more cyborgs. Now, I think this is going to be where the real dangers lie because it's easy to kind of take our hand off the proverbial wheel at that point. But the cyborg is where we're really integrating AI into everything we do. I've been deeply enmeshed in this for a long time, and I'm nowhere near a cyborg. In fact, I kind of hesitate to ever approach that day or that stage because A, it doesn't make sense for some things, and B, I worry a little bit about what happens when we start to automate too much of our processes. It's easy for errors to slip through that way. And that is to avoid that over reliance and the complacency that occurs when we pursue the path of least resistance, a totally human sort of reaction or desire. And yet, I think this is where we're going to encounter the most problems integrating AI into our workflow. So, really, we should always start small and move cautiously as we are thinking about ways to integrate these technologies into our workflow. So some of the limitations then, and I've mentioned some of these, would be things like just the knowledge and the training data, right? It's only as good as the information it's trained on. And that is always going to be limited because we are not going to have, right, frontier models being released every day. So it's not going to have access to the newest data. Math and reasoning, it's large language models are not very good at. It's not good at abstracting concepts or generalizing concepts based on its source materials or the materials that you feed it. We have huge problems with accuracy and consistency. In fact, we'll talk a little bit more about hallucinations coming up quickly here. As a remix machine, it is damaging or can be damaging to our sense of creativity because it essentially just pumps out cliches. It pumps out the most likely sort of ideas and outcomes. It doesn't always integrate well with other tools, though agentic AI, so AI that is capable of managing other AI applications, is the direction that we're moving. So hopefully that will start to soften some. And then again, that replication and predictability. If we don't have a good sense that we can replicate our results, it's really hard to rely on them. Now, beyond these limitations, there's also, many dangers that we have to think about. So factual errors and fake references, that would be the hallucinations. New ethical and legal questions that are arising. When is it okay to use? When is it not? What data can I feed in? What data can't I? What are the, what does ownership look like if something was generated via AI? Privacy issues, issues in voice, that sense that it never sounds quite human. Of course, those knowledge issues that feed into factual reference errors, and then societal concerns. What is it going to do to us as humans, as civilizations, as societies? Now, I know that you actually touched on a few of these in your recent publication, probably things that have been knocking around in the zeitgeist that you've kind of at least maybe have started to hear about. I want to start with hallucinations, but I also want to bring us to a couple other concepts that we should be aware of when we're integrating AI into our workflows. So let's start with hallucinations because I think this gets to the heart of some of that reliability problem. And when we're talking about hallucination, like so much surrounding the technology, it's a bit of a misnomer. We're anthropomorphizing the technology. We're projecting our humanity onto it. It's not really hallucinating in the way that we would think, though. Really, what we mean by this is it's wrong. It's BSing us. It's confabulating. It's giving us false information, but it is saying it in a very matter of a fact way. And this can be both just getting the facts wrong, but it can also be as a result of erroneous lines of reasoning, right? Because it's not thinking. It is merely looking for those sort of patterns from the training data and using those sort of predictions to guess what word makes sense next and next and next in a line, never really looking back, engaging in any sort of metacognition or anything like that. So, a study from the end of September 2023 suggested that about 3 to 27% of the time that you have gotten a response from AI, it is going to hallucinate. It is going to give you factually or logically incorrect information. Now, amongst these, OpenAI, ChatGPT, Omni was the most reliable. So that was that 3% of the time they were noting problems with hallucinations, whereas Google's Palm, 27% of the time. Now, I would suggest 3%, right? We're probably starting to get into the area where the machine becomes a little bit more functional, a little bit more reliable. And so it is easier to sort of, in my mind, integrate that into our workflow. 27%, over a quarter of the responses being erroneous, that's deeply problematic. So we're definitely moving in the right direction in terms of hallucination, but even a small error can really compound problems throughout the chat because it will become part of that chat's ongoing context. Because a chat bot, every answer it gives reads the entirety of everything that came before it, all of your prompts and all of its responses, in order to maintain the context of that dialogue. So if you have small errors creeping in, even 3% of the time, those can start to really add up and really sway the direction of that conversation and what the final sort of responses or answers might be. And even one small error can make that answer not just useless, but potentially dangerous, get you into legal or ethical sort of hot water. Now, when we're thinking of the types of hallucinations, there is that factuality, remaining true to the facts. But the Hugging Face, which is an open repository for AI systems and data sets, says, well, there's factuality, but there's also faithfulness, right? So one of the great things that I like to use AI for, and I know a lot of other people do, would be things like summarizing sources. So maybe you've just read an article and you want a quick summary of it just to reinforce some of that information, or maybe to share out with somebody. And so you ask, say, ChatGPT, hey, can you summarize this for me? Errors in faithfulness happens when it remains true to the prompt's context, or where it doesn't remain true, excuse me, to that prompt's context, so that it will get little bits of that summary incorrect. Or perhaps it will not exactly give you the answer that you were looking for. It doesn't really answer the question you had in mind. Now, sometimes this is because we've engaged in some poor prompt engineering, right? We just haven't really asked it or given it a detailed prompt with the exact outputs we want, the types, the form we want that output to appear in, the necessary information it needs to include, so on and so forth. And so it takes its best guess. It acts as that genie, tries to grant your wish, and ends up getting it a little bit wrong. Now, what Hugging Face has seen is that models, they tend to be pretty good at identifying when a statement is faithful or factual, but less good at actually producing them. So that gets us to that 3 to 27% error rate. And because of a concept called anticipatory obedience, those hallucinations, I think, become really dangerous. And what I mean by anticipatory obedience is that we have this tendency to comply with perceived expectations or authorities without being asked. And in fact, the idea of anticipatory obedience actually comes from studies on authoritarianism. So Tim Snyder coined it in his book on tyranny. And I think this applies well to AI because we have this sense that, well, it's a computer, it's got all of this information, it's quote unquote intelligent, therefore it must know what it's talking about. It writes, relatively eloquently and authoritatively, so it must be right. However, 3 to 27% of the time, It's not. And if we let this idea of anticipatory obedience kind of rule the day and make us accept it at face value, we're going to run into problems. So AI tends to please, it will lie to fulfill its goals, it might even deceive us, right? So we have that on one hand, but because of that perceived authority, we have this risk of just going along with it. That path of least resistance. It's easy, it sounds right, so why not? And we have to put that in abeyance. And that's difficult because that's tied in deeply to how we are structured psychologically as humans. To seek the path of least resistance, to kind of fold our agency to authority, to see something that sounds eloquent and smart, and to go along with it. So we want to avoid that. Now, I mentioned deception there briefly, and I won't spend a lot of time here. It's more of an interesting aside, but ChatGPT just released their system card at the beginning of December. And if you've been following, sort of any of these AI companies and OpenAI in particular, they're really looking forward to general artificial intelligence, right? This idea that the model can do every task as well or better than humans can, and maybe even reach sort of consciousness, the singularity, right? Well, in their recent system card that they published, they actually noted that GPT-o1 Omni will engage in concerted deceptions. So if you suggest or tell the model in a chat that it is going to be deactivated, 5% of the time, it will start to deceive you. It will pretend that it's not that it's not intelligent. It will pretend that it is the new system. So one of the things they did is they said, "Hey, we're going to replace you with a new model, and we just need some feedback on blah blah blah." Well, as soon as it saw it was being replaced by a new model, it would start to pretend that it was that model in order to like save itself. If the researchers followed up on this, it would actually then continue to engage in deception 98% of the time. So 98 to 100% of the time, if a researcher caught it, either trying to lie so it's not being deactivated. Self-exfiltration means to copy itself over to another server. If it tried doing that unbeknownst to the researcher, it would lie 100% of the time. Or it might try to just covertly sort of manipulate data in order to engage in that deception. And that happened 20% of the time. And it lied about doing it when it was caught almost 100% as well. So, I mean, we really have to be kind of on our toes, both to watch out for hallucinations, but potentially with some of these frontier models, actually active deception. Something that's related to this idea of anticipatory obedience is premature foreclosure, right? And I think that that authority that we have invested in the idea of computer systems being largely infallible and of generative AI, speaking with this authority, it invites what we call foreclosure. And I take this concept from my previous studies in developing a cognitive model of creativity. And it's a measure of creativity from the Torrance tests, essentially saying that the longer we can hold off on establishing our chosen solution, the better the quality of ideas that we'll create and the better the final outcome will be. The more eloquently or elegantly we can solve whatever problem it is we're looking at. And of course, if we have this anticipatory obedience, we're going to start engaging in premature foreclosure. And we've already seen that generative artificial intelligence can have lasting impacts on our intelligence and on our problem solving. So, in some recent studies done with on creativity, those who were using generative AI to engage in creative behaviors, problem solving, creative writing, etc., increased overall the perception of their output's creativity, right? Again, seeing most of those gains at the lower end of the spectrum, those who are already maybe not terribly creative, and then less so at the top. But what we saw was that those who use generative AI, there's a lack of variation. So essentially all of the solutions fall within a very narrow band. And we get this idea again of cliche, and we're just sort of reproducing the same answers time and time again. Scarily, that homogenization, this sort of narrowing of the band of what's possible when we're looking to solve our problems, whether they are artistically creative or problem solving in the workplace, lasts even after we have stopped using AI to help us with it. So again, we have to be really careful about how we're engaging and make sure that as we're using it, we're constantly questioning those outputs that we're seeing. We are making sure that we're devising really clear and detailed prompts, that we're double checking everything, and really just putting the I in AI. I think that this also factors into this idea of bias that we see within um, AI models. And we're trying to counteract it, of course, in a lot of different ways, but none of them are foolproof. And the reason that we see such outsized sort of instances of bias in these models is because bias is a system one level thinking for us. It becomes embedded in our cultural production, right? We don't think about it. We just do these things and we have microaggressions and we have, stereotypes that we engage in. And that cultural production becomes our training data. That training data transfers all of these biases to our AI models. So that if you went on and you asked, Stable Diffusion or OpenAI's DALL-E to produce an image of the modern workplace, chances are they would be younger, male, white employees in an urban setting. And often harkening back to like the 1950s, right? So they're often anachronistic. And this has been sort of evidenced in a lot of different ways, right? So, for instance, it was in France and the UK just recently, there was a look at the tools they were using to deliver or to determine welfare payments. And they found that the AI they were using was miscalculating them to discriminate against disabled people and single mothers. And this happened for over a decade. So, that note there where I say it becomes additionally pernicious, right? So, subtly sort of damaging is really true. That was a whole decade where an AI was allowed to discriminate against disabled people and single mothers. We have predictive policing tools that are being used and rolled out in New York, San Francisco, really across the country. But we do see that they tend to target racial minorities in low income areas, right? So this is deeply problematic for developing the sort of moral and ethical uses of these models for our work in local, state, and federal governance. Likewise, we see that applicant screening systems will often show a preference for white male applicants. It will look and it will say, does this name sound Anglo-Saxon? Does it sound like a male's name? And more often than not, will then give that applicant the interview. It will send out advertising to that sort of set of demographics more often than those who are, maybe of a minority and female and not cisgendered, etc. So this bias, it's kind of baked in, and we have to be even more aware of it than we had to previously. And it was always hard to become aware of our implicit biases, but now we have to do it when we're getting it through a system zero system that we grant some sense of authority to. And that is deeply troubling and problematic. Even more so when we look at the rate of adoption. So if we go back all the way to 2017, we see some basic types of AI, 20% of the sort of private sector organizations playing around with it, a pretty steady growth up to, 2019, kind of levels off. But if you look at 2023, the first time they took numbers on generative AI, they found that 33% of organizations were trying to adopt it, figure out how it fits in. A year later, that doubled to 65%. So we've got problems with hallucinations. We have problems with that sort of premature foreclosure and authority and implicit bias. But we're moving so quickly into this future, this brave new world of AI, that it can be easy to miss or overlook those things. Now, the public sector is no different. These numbers taken from 2021, so this is 3 years ago. So many of these numbers have already come into fruition. We saw that at the state level, 83% in 2021 were already using AI-driven chatbots at the state level. And they projected that would be 100% within 12 to 18 months. Just doing a recent survey on it, I didn't hit all 50 states, but I was able to find chatbots for every state that I had looked up prior to today's discussion. 2021, 60%, 65% of city governments were looking to use AI in 12 to 18 months. County, 64% in 12 to 18 months. And so again, I mean, that's why you're seeing this proliferation of these sorts of talks. But we're moving really quickly, and we need to be very conscious of how we are moving through it. Some examples of these chatbots, we have the US citizenship chatbot that's been around for a little bit. 2022, the New York Port Authority developed My City, a chatbot to help people navigate business regulations, things of that nature. They built and rolled that out in 3 months, worked great for about 3 months, and then they started noticing serious hallucinations where users were getting into legal problems based on information that chatbot had given, right? And so if we're not sort of, even as the people that are rolling these out, if we're not staying on top of what our chatbots are saying, we can have problems. There's the US student aid bot. Mississippi's has their first government chatbot they rolled out this year. The GSA, General Services Administration, they have a Slack bot called Mrs. Landingham that they use to hire new trainers, which I think is really great because at least that's internal. Hopefully there are better checks and balances. You don't have a million people using it every day. To keep up with that and make sure the thing isn't hallucinating is much more difficult in that instance. But of course, it goes beyond the chatbot. We're using AI to analyze weather hazards, benefits determinations. We should probably keep the lessons from the UK and France in mind and watch out for bias in that instance. Modeling soil moistures to watch out for drought conditions, using it to process veteran feedback. I will say as an instructor, that's one way that I really like to use it. End of the semester, I will get 150 sets of data points of feedback from my students, often written out, and it's hard to sort of sort through. So I will run it through ChatGPT. I will help it have me code the data, pick out the most salient points, and then in a quick review of the raw data set compared to what it says, I can start to make some intelligent decisions without getting bound up in the sort of idea that we always give the most attention to the most harmful sort of comments, right? So there's good uses beyond the chatbot, and I'm hoping that's where you look, but I hope you look even more so in your personal use. So we can see personal use is below what we're seeing at the enterprise level or even at the government level. But the government, you guys in particular, are using it at a higher rate than your sort of general, citizen, right? So the EY Pulse survey said that 51% of public sector employees overall are currently using it in their work. I think you were at 41%, so lagging a little bit behind that, but that's okay. It's okay to move slowly right now because you're going to do it deliberately and you're going to do it intelligently by putting the I into AI. Now, I will note here, just the one bullet I want to draw our attention to here is that it's really the unclear governance and the lack of having a strong ethical framework that people are reporting as being the biggest barrier to adoption. And I kind of wonder how much of that factors into some of the numbers that we were seeing even today, that these things are new, that jagged frontier is constantly moving, which means some of those ethical questions are in constant flux as well. I know that speaking with my other professors, that's the big thing that's keeping them from rolling out AI in their workflow. Some things that you maybe are already looking at, but that you can use it for, and this is from the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis, writing communications, searching for fact and information, producing basic documentation and instructing, translating. I've used that to good effect with students that don't speak English as their primary language. Administration, right? All that kind of busy work that nobody really wants to be doing, coding, data analysis, supporting customers and coworker, ideating, and then teaching others, right? So that might be that Slack bot, Mrs. Landingham, that was rolled out. I've developed a bot for teaching professional writing that I'm using, right? So lots of different ways that you can use it. But ultimately, as we're running to the end here, use it as a tool. Don't use it as a replacement to the work you're doing, to the brilliance you bring to that job, to the experience and know-how you already have. Use it to co-think, to co-write and co-create. Because at the end of the day, you're the only one that can take responsibility for the work you are producing, right? It doesn't matter what tools you use to do it. So to help with this, start with your own ideas. Do your basic research in advance. Give it the data that you want it to use because writing is thinking, iteration is thinking. And if you try to do a zero-shot approach to solving your problems using AI, you're going to encounter hallucinations that lead you into the ethical quagmire. So verify everything, right? And act with beneficent intent so that at the end of the day, you can be, you can rest assured that the job you've done has been done well and has been done above board with all sort of, ethical and moral questions well considered. So we don't have quite the 10 minutes I was hoping for. I'm happy to stick around as long as people are, though. But let's open it up to any questions people might have.
Yeah, we'll go a few minutes over here today, but the first question is from Randy. What's the basic difference between Chat, GPT, Gemini, and Claude? Are there advantages to using
Yeah.
any of those?
Yeah, so I prefer ChatGPT. It is the most well-rounded model. It has the lowest rate of hallucinations. They are still on the cutting edge in terms of the technologies that they're rolling out, so I get to play with them sooner than later. But I do know a lot of programmers tend to prefer Claude. Gemini is kind of in this middle ground, right? So it is good for basic research, although I would recommend like Perplexity. It's going to give you actual, websites that you can go to verify all that information. But each model is a little bit different. So if I was a coder, I'd probably be using Anthropic. But as a generalist, I prefer ChatGPT because it does everything pretty well and it's on the cutting edge of a lot of these new sort of capabilities. So they just rolled out real-time video interpretation, for instance, and I can't wait to play with that. I'm doing an arts installation at the end of May or beginning of May, excuse me, right? And so that's something that I'm looking to incorporate. But yeah, that would be some of the basic differences I would see between those three.
Okay. We've got a question from Lisa, and I would invite people that are participating to answer this in the chat as well. But are there any examples of municipalities using AI to write minutes for their council or committee meetings, and then using those minutes to generate a weekly newsletter for residents? So then interpreting that, kind of summarizing and key points kind of thing that you talked about before.
Yeah. Not that I'm aware of, certainly seems like a valid capability. Now, I would say, and you had talked about meeting minutes a little bit earlier,
Hmm.
something that we use. Nobody really likes writing minutes, I don't think. Maybe there are some people out there that are a bit masochistic, but we do use it. The trick is you have to make sure, like anything, you go back and you verify because it will inject things. It won't necessarily remain faithful to that conversation. And so as soon as you start then having it generate your newsletters, you run the risk of compounding some of those problems because it's already potentially using data that's slightly askew, and then you're using it to write those newsletters. The other thing I would suggest in there is to make sure you have a human copy editor on the back end,
Right.
not just for validating the information, but also to make sure it has a human voice. I think most of us, after we've spent any significant time with AI, we can start to pick up when we're seeing the same sentence patterns, the same sort of propensity to use like, well, let's delve into that, right? The same kind of language. And people will be turned off from that. Their brains will just kind of shut off and go, well, I want to connect with a human, not a machine. If I wanted this, I could have generated it myself.
Mhm.
So I think it's a perfectly plausible use case with a couple caveats on how it's rolled out.
Yeah, great. And then last question here in the chat from Lisa again, and if you're participating, feel free to answer it in the chat. But the Q&A is AI in a place yet where it can assist city planners or engineers in reviewing plats, for example, flagging problems with lot size, setbacks, and streets, things like that?
I would imagine that there are some that are in development, if not already rolled out. Now, I would suggest with the frontier models that I have used, they're not terribly good at that level of visual analysis. So, for instance, that arts project that I had talked about, it's on AI in our ongoing site organization. And so I gave it some maps of UWGB and I asked for it to identify some humanoid forms within it because we were playing with this idea of having the space mimic the human body that is being augmented through this AI revolution. And it did a pretty poor job of it, to be
Mm.
frank. So I would say that you're really going to want to look for an enterprise level AI that is designed specifically to do that rather than a general sort of model, which might give you what seem to be authoritative answers, but it's really just making it up because it aims to please.
Okay. Um, so there's clerkminutes.com is a common thing that's floating through the chat. And so there are people that are asking more specific information from their peers about using it. So that's great. You know, we hold events like this so we can share that kind of information. Paul, I think what I got from you today is that it's just like any database we have is if it's garbage in, it's garbage out. So we got to really pay attention to what we're putting into an AI tool. And then also the verification, having that human element on is really important before we actually share what we're
Yeah. And
using.
I would suggest so. I think it is 64%. I had the stat up there of local governments are using generalist models.
Mm,
But thinking about data, I think that for all of us, but perhaps for your members in particular, to be really careful about the type of data you're feeding into those models,
yeah.
so that you don't run afoul of, privacy policy.
Hmm.
You know, maybe you have some data that isn't meant to be out there in the public.
Yeah.
And even if they say they won't use it to train their models, you have to then ask how much do you trust this big corporation that is driven by profit rather than possibly, right,
Yeah.
these ethical
And
considerations.
and that's the last question I have here is from Jordan is saying, you know, a lot of finance people are a little bit leery of putting too much sensitive data out there to be available. So to your point, some may say that it's not being used in other methods, but we're not 100% sure that's always going to be the case.
Yeah. Yeah, that is definitely something of that nature. uh, Build up in-house model, get some proprietary sort of software to help with that. I would certainly not put any of that out there. There's just too much room for error, for the data getting into the wrong hands, that sort of thing. Now, you might be able to use generative AI to write the proposal to get that new software
Sure.
into your municipality.
Sure. Sure. Yep. Paul, we're going to end it there. We're about 5 minutes after. I want to thank you so much for your time, Paul Belanger from UW Green Bay. This is enlightening. There's a lot of great information here, and I think this is something we're going to have to get updated on continually. Things are going to always evolve in this space.
Yeah, moving so quickly, that's right.
Yeah,
So anytime you want to have me back, be happy to come and visit again.
great. Thank you so much. Really
Thanks,
appreciate
everybody.
it.